Hi guys, night rested softly over the valley of the Nile. The stars hung above the river as they had for thousands of years, scattered across the dark sky in quiet patterns that farmers, fishermen, and travelers knew by heart. Along the banks of the water, the world of ancient Egypt slept beneath roofs of mud brick and bundles of reeds. Fires had burned low. Bread ovens had cooled. The voices of the day had faded into silence. Only the river still moved. Its black surface carried the moon in broken reflections, while a slow wind crossed the fields and wandered through narrow village streets. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog barked once and then settled again. Sand shifted against stone walls. Palm leaves whispered to one another. The great monuments that would one day amaze distant generations stood far away in the darkness, silent and motionless. Yet beneath their enormous shadows lived countless ordinary people whose names have long disappeared. Most of them would wake before sunrise. The truth about Egypt's repetitive lifestyle was not hidden inside royal tombs or carved into the polished walls of temples. It lived instead in the small routines that returned every morning. It could be found in the footsteps of workers crossing dusty roads before dawn. It rested in the hands of women grinding grain for bread. It drifted above cooking fires and followed fishermen onto quiet water. For many people, life unfolded in circles that changed very little from one season to the next. A laborer might rise before the first light touched the eastern horizon. He would wash his face with cool water from a clay jar and sit quietly for a moment while the rest of the household stirred awake around him. The same sounds greeted him every day. The rustling of linen blankets. The creaking of wooden doors. The low voices of family members preparing for another long stretch of work beneath the sun. Ancient Egypt was a world built upon rhythm. The river flooded, then withdrew. Seeds were planted, crops were harvested, and fields rested before beginning the cycle once more. Children grew into adults and took the places of their parents. Scribes trained apprentices who copied the same symbols year after year. Builders shaped stone blocks with familiar tools, using methods that had already been practiced by earlier generations. People did not expect life to transform quickly. Many spent their entire lives within sight of the same riverbank, the same cluster of homes, and the same dusty paths winding between fields. The world beyond the horizon existed, of course, but for ordinary families it remained distant and almost dreamlike. Their attention stayed fixed on immediate tasks, repairing sandals, carrying water, baking bread, tending animals, and enduring the heat. Long before the sun appeared, some villages had already begun to awaken. Inside a small house built from dried mud bricks, a woman sat beside a grinding stone. The room was simple. Its walls held the warmth of yesterday's sun, though the night air remained cool. Clay jars lined one corner. Woven baskets rested near the doorway. A reed mat covered part of the floor where children still slept. She poured grain onto the stone and began to grind. The sound was steady and familiar. Stone against stone. Grain becoming flour. It was work she had performed countless times before. Her mother had done the same. Her grandmother as well. The task demanded patience and strength, yet there was comfort in its repetition. Morning after morning, the movement remained unchanged. Outside, the eastern sky slowly lightened. Men emerged from neighboring homes, fastening simple linen garments around their waists. Some carried tools over their shoulders. Others carried baskets or ropes. They spoke quietly as they gathered in the dim light, careful not to disturb the peace that still lingered before the day's labor began. The air smelled of dust, smoke, and damp earth from the river. As the first birds called from the reeds, workers made their way along narrow roads. Sandals scraped against stone. Donkeys shifted under heavy loads. Farmland stretched outward in dark shapes waiting for the sun. The Nile itself moved beside them, calm and patient, as though it had witnessed this exact morning 1,000 times before. For farmers, repetition governed everything. Their lives depended on understanding the moods of the river. When the flood waters arrived, fields disappeared beneath muddy water. Villages adapted to the changing landscape. Boats became more important than roads. People measured time through the rise and fall of the Nile, trusting patterns that had guided their ancestors. When the waters retreated, the work intensified. Farmers stepped into wet soil carrying wooden plows and simple tools. Oxen pulled through the earth at a slow pace. Seeds scattered into freshly exposed ground. Days passed beneath a blazing sky. Muscles ached. Feet became coated in mud. Yet the work continued because the harvest months lay far ahead, and survival depended upon preparation. The labor rarely changed. One season resembled the next. Children learned the routines by watching older relatives. They understood the order of tasks before they could fully explain them. Fetch water. Gather reeds. Feed animals. Help prepare meals. Sweep dust from the floor, knowing that more dust would return tomorrow. Even the houses reflected this rhythm. Most homes were practical rather than grand. Thick mud brick walls helped keep out the heat. Small windows allowed air to move through narrow rooms. Families slept close together on mats stuffed with reeds or simple fibers. Possessions were few and often handmade. The floors were cool in the morning. As daylight spread across the village, sunlight entered doorways and illuminated familiar objects, clay bowls worn smooth by years of use, baskets patched and repaired many times, jars carrying water from the river. Nothing inside these homes existed for decoration alone. Nearly every object served a purpose in the endless cycle of daily life. Children awakened to the same sounds each morning. They listened to adults discussing the day's work while bread baked nearby. Younger children remained close to their mothers, while older ones gradually accepted greater responsibilities. Some boys followed their fathers into fields or workshops. Some girls learned the long process of preparing food, spinning fibers, and caring for younger siblings. Childhood itself was shaped by repetition. Days passed beneath the sun. Lessons came not from books but from observation. A child learned where to collect water, how to carry baskets, and how to recognize the changing seasons. Skills developed slowly through countless small tasks repeated over many years. Along the riverbank, fishermen untied ropes securing their boats. Morning mist drifted above the water while nets lay coiled at their feet. The river offered food, transportation, and work, but it demanded patience. Fishermen understood the currents and knew where fish gathered. They had inherited this knowledge from fathers and grandfathers whose own lives followed the same quiet patterns. The boats pushed away from shore. Wood creaked softly. Oars dipped into dark water. Behind them, villages continued waking as smoke rose into the sky. Ahead lay another day spent under the sun, searching familiar stretches of river that rarely surprised them. Hours passed slowly in ancient Egypt. There were no sudden changes to interrupt the rhythm of ordinary life. Work unfolded according to the movement of light across the sky. The morning brought energy and cool air. By midday, heat settled over the land like a heavy blanket. People adjusted their bodies to this reality. Farmers paused beneath narrow patches of shade. Builders wiped sweat from their faces. Merchants sat quietly beside their goods, waiting for customers. The entire landscape seemed to slow beneath the bright sun. Near the great building sites, another world of repetition existed. The monuments of ancient Egypt appear extraordinary to modern eyes, but the people who built them experienced something much simpler. Their days were filled with ordinary labor repeated again and again. Stonecutters struck rock with copper tools. Teams of workers hauled heavy blocks along prepared roads. Scribes recorded supplies and measured progress. The work camps surrounding these projects became temporary villages. Rows of sleeping quarters stretched across dusty ground. Cooking fires burned each evening. Water jars stood in shaded corners. Workers shared meals of bread, onions, fish, and beer before resting their tired bodies. Morning always arrived too soon. A laborer sleeping on a simple mat might wake with aching muscles and sore hands. He would sit quietly in the gray light before joining the long procession toward the day's tasks. Around him, hundreds of others moved in the same direction, carrying tools worn smooth from constant use. The work required endurance more than speed. Large stones did not move quickly. Roads had to be prepared. Ropes needed repair. Sledges had to be pulled steadily across the earth. Teams coordinated their efforts through songs and rhythms designed to keep everyone moving together. Dust filled the air. It settled onto skin, clothing, and food. It gathered inside sandals and clung to hair. Workers breathed it throughout the day while the desert sun climbed overhead. Yet by evening, much of that dust washed away in river water, only to return with the next sunrise. Life for scribes appeared gentler, though it too followed repetitive patterns. Inside administrative buildings and workshops, scribes sat cross-legged with brushes and sheets of papyrus. They copied records, counted supplies, and preserved orders from officials. Their hands moved carefully across the page, tracing symbols learned through years of practice. The training of a scribe demanded patience. Young students spent countless hours repeating signs and memorizing formulas. Mistakes required correction. Lessons returned day after day. Though scribes avoided much of the physical labor endured by farmers and builders, their lives remained governed by routine. The same documents passed across their desks. Inventories of grain. Lists of workers. Measurements of land. Records of taxes. The work rarely carried excitement. Instead, it depended upon consistency and attention to detail. Entire careers unfolded through the steady repetition of familiar tasks. Merchants lived according to their own rhythms. In marketplaces, voices rose beneath awnings that offered little protection from the heat. Traders arranged baskets of vegetables, fish, pottery, and cloth. Customers arrived throughout the morning carrying goods to exchange. The market changed slightly from one day to the next, but its deeper patterns remained constant. People bargained over prices. Donkeys carried supplies through crowded paths. Children wandered beside adults. Dust drifted through the air while the smell of bread and cooking fires spread across the village. By midday, the heat became difficult to ignore. Shadows shortened. Stone walls radiated warmth. Workers slowed their movements to preserve energy. Many sought shelter wherever they could find it. Some rested beneath palm trees. Others sat inside cool rooms with thick walls. Fatigue belonged to everyone. Ancient Egypt was beautiful, but it was also exhausting. The sun demanded respect. Long hours of physical labor left bodies sore and weary. Illness moved quietly through crowded communities. Infections, injuries, and fever were familiar companions in a world without modern medicine. Even small wounds could become serious. A cut received while working in a quarry or harvesting grain might linger for weeks. Muscles strained under heavy loads. Backs ached from bending and lifting. Yet for most people, work could not simply stop. Families depended on one another. When someone became ill, relatives carried additional responsibilities. Children worked harder. Neighbors offered help when possible. Communities survived because daily routines connected everyone together. As afternoon faded toward evening, villages slowly changed once again. Workers returned along dusty roads. Fishermen guided boats back toward shore. Farmers left their fields. The loudest hours of labor slipped away, replaced by quieter tasks closer to home. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Inside small houses, women mixed dough and prepared simple meals. Grain that had been ground before sunrise finally became bread. Clay ovens radiated heat into narrow rooms. Children gathered nearby, hungry after long days spent outdoors. The evening meal was rarely elaborate. Bread formed the center of life. Fish, vegetables, dates, and onions appeared when available. Beer provided nourishment and relief from thirst. Families sat together beneath fading light, sharing food and conversation before darkness returned. There was comfort in familiar meals. People ate the same foods again and again because those foods sustained them. Recipes changed slowly across generations. The taste of fresh bread, the smell of smoke, and the sound of voices around the fire formed the foundation of home. Outside, the sky deepened into shades of orange and purple. The river reflected the last light of the day while birds settled among reeds along the shore. Workers stretched tired muscles. Parents soothed restless children. The village softened as darkness approached. Night in ancient Egypt carried its own routines. Doors were secured. Animals were gathered close. Oil lamps flickered against mud-brick walls. Stories passed quietly between family members while cool air finally replaced the heat of the afternoon. Many people slept on rooftops during the warm months. Above the narrow streets, families spread mats beneath the stars. The breeze offered relief after the long day. Children drifted to sleep listening to distant voices, barking dogs, and the endless movement of the Nile. For a few hours, labor disappeared. Hands that had carried stone, harvested grain, or rowed boats finally rested. Bodies exhausted by repetition surrendered to sleep. Yet even in dreams, tomorrow already waited. Because dawn would return. The grinding stones would sound again. Bread would bake once more. Farmers would walk toward their fields. Scribes would unroll papyrus. Builders would lift their tools beneath the rising sun. And so the great civilization of Egypt continued, not only through kings and monuments, but through countless ordinary lives shaped by routine, patience, and the quiet repetition of everyday work. Far from palaces and temples, beyond the carved statues and painted walls, entire generations moved through nearly identical days. Their stories were simple. Their schedules rarely changed. Their world turned slowly around the river that sustained them. And while the stars crossed the sky above sleeping villages, another morning quietly approached the eastern horizon. The first light of morning rarely arrived with sudden brightness. Instead, it spread slowly across the eastern horizon, touching the tops of palm trees and the distant edges of the desert. The villages beside the Nile emerged from darkness one small detail at a time. Mud brick walls gained color. Boats resting along the shore became visible again. Thin trails of smoke began to rise into the cool air. For the people of ancient Egypt, this gentle return of daylight marked the beginning of another familiar day, one that would resemble hundreds that had come before. Inside a modest home near the river, a family stirred awake. The room was still dim, and the heat of the afternoon had not yet arrived. A child turned beneath a linen covering while his mother sat up and reached for a clay lamp that had nearly burned out during the night. In the corner stood baskets filled with grain, jars of water, and a few carefully folded pieces of clothing. Nothing in the room was new. The walls had been repaired many times. Small cracks had been covered with fresh mud after the flood season. Wooden stools carried the marks of years of use. Every object belonged to a routine that stretched backward through generations. Outside, the village had begun to move. A man crossed the narrow street carrying 2 empty jars suspended from a wooden pole across his shoulders. He walked toward the riverbank, following a path worn smooth by countless footsteps. Others traveled the same route each morning. Some greeted one another quietly. Others remained silent, still heavy with sleep. The Nile welcomed them with its steady presence. Its waters flowed northward just as they always had. In some places the river moved quickly around bends and islands. In others it seemed almost still, reflecting the pale colors of dawn. Along the shore, reeds bent gently in the breeze, and birds stepped through the shallows in search of food. Water shaped every hour of Egyptian life. Without it, the fields would dry and crack beneath the sun. Without it, villages could not survive in the harsh landscape that surrounded them. Yet because the river was so dependable, daily life became dependable as well. The same tasks returned each morning because the same needs returned with them. Women filled jars and balanced them carefully on their heads or shoulders. Children carried smaller containers beside their parents. The trip to the river was not an event worth remembering. It was simply part of the rhythm of living. Nearby, the smell of baking bread drifted from several homes. Preparing bread demanded time and effort. Grain had to be crushed into flour using heavy stones. Water needed to be mixed into the dough. Fires had to be maintained. The work occupied many hours, yet it was so common that few people paused to think about it. A young girl sat beside her mother, pressing dough into shape with hands still too small for the task. She had watched the process since infancy. One day she would teach it to her own children, just as her mother had learned from older women in the family. The repetitive nature of Egyptian life was not something people fought against. Instead, it formed the structure of their world. Familiar tasks created order. Predictable routines gave shape to each season. A person could wake before sunrise and already know much of what the day would contain. In the distance, farmers guided animals toward the fields. The floodwaters had withdrawn weeks earlier, leaving behind dark and fertile earth. Wooden plows scraped through the soil while birds followed close behind, searching for insects and scattered seeds. The work progressed slowly. The sun climbed higher. Sweat gathered on foreheads. Hours passed with very little change. One man walked behind his oxen, turning the soil in long lines. Another scattered seed from a woven basket hanging at his side. A third repaired an irrigation ditch damaged by shifting water. None of these tasks were dramatic. They required endurance rather than excitement. The fields themselves seemed endless. Green plants stretched beside narrow canals. Palm trees offered small patches of shade. Beyond the fertile land stood the desert, silent and unmoving beneath the morning sky. Egypt existed between these two worlds, between life and emptiness, between water and sand. For farmers, the boundaries were always visible. They understood that survival depended upon staying close to the river's gift. Villages clustered along the Nile because little life could exist far beyond its reach. Travelers crossing the desert faced heat, thirst, and exhaustion. Most people preferred the safety of familiar fields and familiar roads. Children often worked nearby. A boy chased birds away from young crops. Two sisters gathered bundles of reeds. Younger children carried water to older relatives laboring beneath the sun. there was little separation between childhood and responsibility. Work entered life early and remained there for decades. Yet moments of quiet happiness still existed. Children laughed as they splashed in shallow water near the riverbank. Friends whispered to one another while completing simple tasks. Families gathered at dusk to share food and stories. Life was difficult, but it was not without comfort. As the morning advanced, workshops throughout the villages came alive. Potters sat beside spinning wheels, shaping wet clay into jars and bowls. Carpenters worked beneath shaded roofs, smoothing wood with bronze tools. Weavers stretched linen threads across simple frames. The sounds of labor filled the air. Tap. Scrape. Turn. The rhythm of tools became part of the landscape. A potter might spend his entire life creating vessels that looked almost identical. One jar for grain. Another for oil. A larger container for water. Day after day, his hands repeated the same motions until they no longer required conscious thought. His workshop smelled of damp clay and smoke from the kiln. Finished pots stood against the walls in careful rows. Dust covered the floor. Sunlight entered through narrow openings and illuminated tiny particles drifting through the air. Apprentices moved quietly nearby, learning through observation and repetition. Knowledge passed slowly in ancient Egypt. Most skills were not written down. They traveled from one person to another through years of practice. A father showed his son how to carve wood. A mother demonstrated the correct way to bake bread. An older worker taught a younger one how to pull stone across rough ground. Learning required patience. Mistakes happened often, especially among the young. Clay cracked in the kiln. Bread burned in the oven. A fishing net tore at the worst moment. Yet people tried again because daily life left little choice. Survival depended on mastering ordinary tasks. Near the larger towns, scribes had already settled into their work. They occupied a different place in society, though their days remained repetitive in their own way. Seated on woven mats, they prepared ink and unrolled sheets of papyrus. Sunlight filtered into administrative buildings while officials discussed supplies, taxes, and labor. The scribes listened carefully. Their brushes moved across the page with practiced precision. Symbols flowed in neat lines. Grain deliveries were recorded. Land boundaries were measured. Lists of workers filled one document after another. For hours at a time, very little changed. A young apprentice copied the same characters repeatedly, trying to match the elegant handwriting of his teacher. Mistakes were corrected. Lessons continued. Education demanded discipline, and discipline depended on repetition. Outside those buildings, merchants arranged their goods beneath awnings stretched against the sun. The market was one of the few places where different worlds met. Farmers arrived with baskets of vegetables. Fishermen brought their catch from the river. Potters displayed newly fired jars. Cloth merchants unfolded linen woven in nearby workshops. The smells mixed together. Fresh bread. River fish. Warm dust. Smoke. Sweat. Voices drifted through the crowded paths as buyers and sellers negotiated. Donkeys stood patiently beneath heavy loads. Children followed their parents through the market, absorbing the rhythms of trade that they would one day understand for themselves. Yet even the busiest market had quiet moments. During the hottest part of the day, activity slowed. People searched for shade beneath walls and trees. Conversations softened. Workers paused to drink water and eat simple meals. The Egyptian sun ruled everything. By midday, stone surfaces became painfully hot. Sand reflected the light upward. The air itself seemed heavy. Men wrapping cloth around their heads sought protection from the brightness. Women retreated into cooler rooms when possible. Many tasks simply had to wait. Builders rested beside unfinished walls. Farmers sat beneath palm trees. Scribes wiped sweat from their brows and stretched cramped hands. The entire landscape appeared to breathe more slowly beneath the heat. Fatigue settled into people's bodies not as an occasional visitor, but as a permanent companion. A fisherman felt it in his shoulders after rowing against the current. A laborer carried it in his back after hauling stone. A mother experienced it after long hours of grinding grain and caring for children. Exhaustion belonged to nearly everyone. Even sleep offered only temporary relief. The mats on which people rested were simple. Homes provided shelter, but not luxury. During the warm season, mosquitoes drifted near the river. Dogs barked in distant streets. Babies cried during the night. Rest came in small portions before another day of labor began. Illness moved quietly through these communities as well. A fever could keep someone indoors for days. Dust irritated lungs. Bad water caused sickness. A damaged tooth might bring pain for years. Ancient healers possessed herbs, prayers, and practical experience, but many problems remained beyond their reach. Families adapted as best they could. If a father fell ill, older children accepted additional work. If a mother became weak from exhaustion, neighbors sometimes offered assistance. Entire households adjusted themselves around hardship because hardship was expected. In villages near major construction sites, labor camps stretched across the dry land. The workers who helped build temples, tombs, and monuments lived according to strict schedules. They rose before dawn, gathered their tools, and moved together toward the day's tasks. Their lives were shaped by the demands of stone. At the quarry, the sound of work echoed against the rock. Copper chisels struck limestone. Wooden sledges creaked beneath heavy loads. Teams of men pulled ropes in unison, their footsteps sinking into dust. Supervisors watched carefully while scribes recorded supplies and attendance. The work demanded coordination more than speed. Massive blocks could not be rushed. Every movement required planning. Men worked shoulder to shoulder for hours beneath the sun, pausing only briefly to drink water and eat. In the evenings, they returned to their quarters exhausted. Their homes near the work sites were plain. Sleeping rooms held rows of mats. Clay ovens provided bread. Water jars lined the walls. Conversation drifted through the camp as darkness settled across the desert. Some workers spoke of families waiting in distant villages. Others remained silent, too tired to do more than eat and sleep. Their hands bore scars from years of labor. Their skin darkened beneath the sun. Their muscles remembered movements repeated thousands of times. Yet life continued. Morning followed night. Work followed rest. The seasons turned. For servants inside wealthy households, repetition took a different form. Long before sunrise, they swept courtyards and carried water. Floors had to be cleaned. Clothing needed washing. Meals required preparation. Their labor remained largely invisible, hidden behind walls and shaded gardens. A servant girl might spend an entire day moving between storage rooms and kitchens. She carried baskets of grain. She fetched oil from clay jars. She helped bake bread and clean dishes. By evening, her feet ached from walking across stone floors, but the same tasks would return tomorrow. The wealthy enjoyed greater comfort, yet even their lives were built upon routine. Officials met with scribes. Priests performed ceremonies. Landowners inspected fields. The details differed, but repetition remained at the center of Egyptian society. The priests themselves lived according to carefully ordered schedules. Inside temple walls, incense drifted through cool halls of stone. Rituals followed ancient patterns preserved across generations. Sacred objects were cleaned. Prayers were spoken. Offerings were prepared. Day after day, the ceremonies continued. The temple existed outside ordinary time, yet the people serving within it still experienced familiar rhythms. They woke, worked, ate, and slept like everyone else. As afternoon slowly faded, shadows lengthened across the fields. Farmers gathered tools. Merchants packed unsold goods. Fishing boats appeared once more along the river. Children returned home covered in dust. The long day began its gradual movement toward evening. The air cooled little by little. Birds crossed the sky in dark groups. Smoke rose from village ovens. Along the Nile, water reflected the changing colors of the sunset. Families reunited after hours spent apart. A laborer stepped into his home and removed worn sandals. His children greeted him. Nearby, bread baked over the fire while someone stirred a pot of vegetables. The room filled with familiar smells that marked the end of another day. Conversation was often simple. People spoke about the harvest, about repairs that needed to be made, about neighbors, about the condition of the river. They discussed tomorrow's work because tomorrow would resemble today. And perhaps that was the deepest truth of Egypt's repetitive lifestyle. The greatness of the civilization rested not only upon kings or monuments, but upon millions of ordinary moments that repeated endlessly across centuries. The same roads carried workers. The same ovens baked bread. The same river flowed north beneath the stars. As darkness returned to the valley, lamps flickered behind small windows. Families climbed to rooftops to escape the lingering heat trapped inside their homes. The sounds of the village softened once more. Children drifted toward sleep while adults sat quietly beneath the night sky. Above them, the stars shone with the same calm light that had guided their ancestors. Below them, the Nile moved through the darkness, carrying tomorrow toward them with its patient and unchanging rhythm. Long after the last cooking fire had faded into embers, the villages along the Nile rested beneath a deep and peaceful darkness. The day's labor had ended, but traces of it still remained everywhere. Sandals sat beside doorways coated with dust from distant fields. Empty baskets leaned against walls. Fishing nets hung from wooden poles to dry in the cool night air. The silence was never complete. From somewhere beyond the houses came the soft cry of birds hidden among the reeds. Water touched the muddy banks of the river in slow and gentle movements. A donkey shifted in its sleep. Palm branches swayed overhead, stirred by a breeze that had traveled across the desert. For a few quiet hours, Egypt belonged to sleep. Families rested close together inside small rooms or beneath the open sky. Many homes had flat roofs where people spread woven mats during the warm months. Above them stretched an endless blanket of stars. Children drifted into dreams while listening to the voices of adults speaking softly in the darkness. The next day had not yet arrived, but everyone already understood what it would bring. There would be bread to bake and fields to tend. Boats would leave the shore before sunrise. Scribes would prepare their ink. Builders would return to stone and dust. Life moved forward, though rarely in unexpected ways. For most people, there was comfort in knowing exactly what awaited them. A farmer living near the Nile might count his years not by dramatic events, but by the endless sequence of harvests. One flood season blended gently into the next. He remembered years when the waters rose high and years when they did not. He remembered repairs to his home, the births of children, and the loss of older relatives. Yet the rhythm beneath these memories remained steady. Morning followed morning. Season followed season. The river returned. This constancy shaped the minds of ordinary Egyptians. They lived in a world where stability mattered more than change. A family hoped for healthy crops, strong children, and a peaceful household. Great ambitions belonged mostly to rulers and officials. For everyone else, survival depended upon maintaining familiar routines. Before dawn, while the stars still shone brightly above the western desert, the first sounds of waking slowly returned. An old man stirred beneath a linen covering. He listened for a moment to the quiet breathing of his family. Nearby, a small clay lamp flickered weakly. The air was cool, carrying with it the smell of earth and distant water. He rose carefully. His joints ached from years of labor in the fields. The pain was familiar. It greeted him every morning like an old companion. Outside, the village remained dark, but he could already hear movement from neighboring homes. Somewhere nearby, grain was being poured onto a grinding stone. The sound was low and steady. Back and forth. Back and forth. The rhythm filled the early hours of countless Egyptian homes. Women spent enormous portions of their lives preparing food. Grinding grain demanded strength and patience. It was repetitive work that left hands rough and shoulders sore. A young woman bent over the stone while her children still slept nearby. She had learned the motion as a child herself. At first, the work had seemed endless. Later, it became automatic, a task her body understood without effort. She worked in the dim light while outside the sky slowly changed color. The eastern horizon softened from black to gray. Birds began calling to one another from the riverbank. The village awakened piece by piece, as though pulled gently from sleep. Soon the streets filled with familiar figures. Farmers carrying wooden tools walked toward the fields. Fishermen made their way to the shore. Children hurried after older relatives, still rubbing sleep from their eyes. The same paths that had been traveled yesterday welcomed new footsteps. Dust rose beneath sandals. It settled again. Then more feet disturbed it. The roads of ancient Egypt carried generations of workers who repeated the same journeys every day. Some routes led to farmland. Others wound toward workshops, temples, or markets. Most people could walk them in darkness without losing their way. Along the riverbank, fishermen prepared their boats. The Nile looked different each morning, yet it remained the same river their ancestors had known. Its surface reflected the pale colors of dawn. Gentle waves rocked wooden boats tied to posts driven into the mud. The fishermen checked their nets with practiced hands. They searched for tears and loose knots. They untangled ropes. Little needed to be said. After years on the river, every movement had become familiar. Then the boats drifted away from shore. Oars dipped quietly into the water. Ripples spread outward across the surface. Behind them, the villages continued to wake beneath the growing light. Fishing was rarely exciting. Most days followed predictable patterns. Men cast their nets in places they already knew. They watched birds circle overhead and studied the currents flowing around reeds and islands. Hours passed in silence, broken only by splashing water and the creak of wood. The work could be exhausting. The sun climbed steadily higher. Arms grew tired from rowing. Wet nets became heavy with fish and river water. Yet the fishermen returned again and again because their families depended upon what the river provided. Farther inland, farmers entered the fields. The cool air of morning would not last long. Everyone understood this. They worked quickly while the temperature remained bearable. Wooden plows cut into dark soil left behind by the flood waters. Oxen moved slowly forward, guided by familiar voices. Nearby, children chased birds away from newly planted crops. A small boy stood alone at the edge of a field, waving his arms whenever flocks descended toward the grain. It was simple work, but important. He had performed the task before, and he would perform it many times again. The repetitive lifestyle of Egypt shaped childhood as much as adulthood. Children grew up surrounded by routine. They learned when the river would rise and when it would retreat. They recognized the smell of bread baking before sunrise. They understood the sounds of tools striking stone and the sight of workers returning home covered in dust. Their games often mirrored the world around them. Boys pretended to steer boats along the riverbank. Girls practiced weaving reeds into small baskets. Younger children followed older siblings everywhere, absorbing knowledge without realizing it. There were few surprises. Life unfolded according to patterns that everyone accepted. In workshops scattered across towns and villages, artisans settled into another day of labor. Potters pressed wet clay between their fingers. Carpenters measured wood. Linen weavers sat before large frames stretched with thread. The weaving rooms could be warm and crowded. Dust floated through beams of sunlight. Threads crossed one another in neat rows. Hands moved with remarkable speed, repeating the same motions hour after hour. A weaver might spend months creating cloth for a wealthy household or a temple. Yet the process itself changed very little. Threads were pulled tight. Knots were tied. Patterns slowly emerged. The work demanded concentration, but it also encouraged quiet thought. The repetitive movements created a rhythm of their own. Workers listened to conversations around them or simply focused on the steady motion of their hands. Time seemed to pass differently inside these workshops. Nearby, potters shaped clay taken from the riverbanks. The earth of the Nile had always provided material for everyday life. Jars for storing grain. Bowls for food. Lamps for the night. Pottery filled every Egyptian home, though few people gave much thought to the labor required to create it. A potter sat beside his wheel as he had done for many years. His fingers carried memories of countless vessels. He knew exactly how much pressure to apply and when to add water. Apprentices watched him closely, hoping to master the same skills. Outside the workshop, merchants arranged goods in the marketplace. By mid-morning, the market had become lively. Farmers arrived with vegetables and bundles of reeds. Fishermen carried baskets of their catch. Traders displayed linen, pottery, oils, and tools. Voices rose and fell beneath the growing heat. Bargaining was part of daily life, but even these conversations followed familiar patterns. Sellers praised their goods. Buyers argued for lower prices. Agreements were reached. Transactions were recorded. For many merchants, every day resembled the last. They stood in the same places. They greeted the same customers. They heard the same complaints and requests. Their work depended on memory and patience rather than novelty. At the edges of the market, scribes observed the activity. Their profession offered prestige, yet it demanded its own form of repetition. Seated cross-legged, they dipped brushes into ink and copied symbols onto papyrus. The writing itself required years of practice. Young apprentices spent endless hours memorizing signs. Their teachers corrected mistakes with strict attention. Hands cramped. Eyes grew tired. Lessons continued. Some students dreamed of escaping the difficult labor of the fields by becoming scribes. Yet the life of a scribe brought different burdens. Long days bent over documents strained the body in quieter ways. Records filled their lives. Measurements of grain. Lists of workers. Taxes. Supplies. Deliveries. Every number mattered. The great machinery of Egyptian society depended upon careful organization, and scribes helped maintain that order. As the sun climbed toward its highest point, shadows shrank beneath people's feet. Heat spread across the land. The cool freshness of dawn disappeared. Stone walls absorbed warmth. Dusty roads shimmered in the distance. Even the river seemed to move more slowly beneath the blazing sky. Workers paused whenever possible. Farmers gathered beneath palm trees. Builders rested beside unfinished walls. Merchants sat beneath cloth coverings stretched above their stalls. Conversations became quieter. People conserved their energy. The heat of Egypt shaped daily schedules as much as the river itself. Labor began early because everyone understood what awaited them in the afternoon. Bodies adapted to the climate, but they never escaped it entirely. Exhaustion accumulated slowly over years. An old builder carried scars on his hands from hauling stone. His back ached constantly. His knees stiffened each morning. Yet he continued working because there were few alternatives. The same could be said for countless others. Women bent over grinding stones developed sore shoulders. Fishermen strained muscles pulling heavy nets. Farmers suffered beneath the sun season after season. Ancient Egypt was a civilization built through repetition, but repetition carried a physical cost. People aged early. Faces became lined from sunlight and wind. Hands hardened. Feet toughened from endless walking. The body remembered every year of labor. Illness visited households regularly. A cough might linger for weeks. Fever could spread through entire families. Infections troubled workers injured by tools or sharp stone. Healing methods existed, but recovery was uncertain. Even so, daily responsibilities rarely disappeared. Bread still had to be baked. Fields still needed water. Animals still required care. Life continued because it had to continue. By late afternoon, the light softened once more. The worst of the heat began to fade. Long shadows stretched across the fields and roads. Farmers gathered their tools. Boats turned toward shore. The return home formed one of the most familiar scenes in Egyptian life. Groups of laborers walked together through drifting dust. Their clothing carried the smell of sweat and earth. Their conversations were quiet, shaped by fatigue. Children ran ahead toward the village. Dogs barked. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Women prepared evening meals while younger children played nearby. Clay ovens glowed with heat. Fresh bread emerged, filling narrow streets with its comforting smell. Inside one home, an elderly woman sat near the doorway, weaving reeds into baskets. She worked slowly now. Her hands no longer moved as quickly as they once had. Yet the rhythm remained. Twist. Fold. Pull. The pattern had stayed with her for decades. Around her, family members moved through familiar routines. A daughter carried water. A grandson swept the floor. Someone repaired a damaged sandal. Someone else prepared fish for cooking. No single task seemed important on its own. Together, however, they formed the foundation of everyday life. As darkness approached, the pace of the village changed. The noise of labor faded into softer sounds. People washed dust from their skin. Children ate hungrily after long days outdoors. Lamps flickered inside homes. Then, one by one, voices began to disappear. The stars returned above the Nile. Cool air drifted through the streets. Families climbed to rooftops carrying blankets and woven mats. Some remained awake for a while, speaking quietly beneath the night sky. Others fell asleep almost immediately. The labor of the day weighed heavily upon them. Tomorrow would bring the same roads, the same fields, the same boats and workshops. Yet for the people of ancient Egypt, this repetition was not unusual or burdensome in the way distant generations might imagine. It was simply life. It was the rhythm of the river. It was the comfort of familiar voices and familiar work. And beneath the stars, while the Nile continued its endless journey through the darkness, another quiet morning slowly moved closer. Before the first hint of dawn reached the horizon, the Nile Valley existed in a world of soft shadows and cool air. The great heat of the previous day had faded into the darkness, leaving behind a silence that settled over the villages like a blanket. The river flowed quietly between its banks, carrying small pieces of reed and drifting leaves toward distant lands that most people would never see. In one village, a lamp still glowed inside a small house built from mud brick. Its walls were thick and uneven, shaped by hands that had long since disappeared. The home had stood through many flood seasons. Rain was rare, but the wind and the sun slowly wore away at everything. Every few years, the family repaired cracks in the walls with fresh mud gathered from the riverbank. The house was simple. A few woven mats rested on the floor. Clay jars stood in one corner, filled with grain, oil, and water. Wooden stools surrounded a low table darkened by years of use. A reed basket hung from a peg near the doorway, holding bread left from the evening meal. The people inside still slept. An older man lay on the roof beneath a linen covering. He had spent his entire life in the same village, walking the same roads and working the same fields that his father and grandfather had known. In his dreams, the boundaries between one year and another often blurred together. Memories of different harvests mixed into one long story of labor, family, and changing seasons. For ordinary Egyptians, time moved differently than it does for many people today. Years were not marked by sudden events. They were measured by floods, harvests, and the slow aging of parents and children. The great monuments rising in the distance were impressive, but they remained far from the center of daily life. Most people cared far more about whether the grain stores were full, whether the roof needed repairs, and whether the coming season would be kind. As the stars began to fade, movement returned to the village. A woman stepped quietly across the floor so as not to wake the youngest children. She wrapped a piece of linen around herself and opened the door. The air outside was cool against her skin. Across the narrow street, another family had already awakened. Somewhere nearby came the familiar sound of grain being crushed into flour. The work began early because it had to. Bread was not a luxury. It was the center of nearly every meal. The preparation took hours, and the labor behind it stretched far beyond the simple act of eating. Grain had to be planted and harvested. It needed to be stored safely, carried home, and ground into flour. Each loaf contained countless hours of human effort. The woman sat beside a grinding stone and began her work. Her arms moved in a rhythm she had practiced since childhood. The motion was repetitive and demanding. It required strength in the shoulders and back. By the end of the day, her muscles would ache, but tomorrow she would repeat the same task. The stone made a quiet sound as it moved. Back and forth. Back and forth. Outside, the sky slowly changed. A pale band of light appeared above the eastern desert. Birds hidden among the reeds stirred awake. Along the riverbank, fishermen prepared their boats in near silence. The fishermen understood the Nile in a way that few others did. They knew where the current was strongest and where fish gathered beneath the surface. They could recognize changes in the wind simply by watching the movement of the water. Most of what they knew had never been written down. Knowledge passed from parent to child through years of observation and repetition. A boy might spend his early life sitting quietly in the boat beside his father, watching how the nets were thrown and how the oars cut through the river. The lessons came slowly. There were no long explanations. Instead, there was practice. A knot tied once. Then tied again. A net repaired. Then repaired another time. An oar held correctly. Then held that way for years. The repetitive lifestyle of Egypt shaped not only the body, but also the way people learned. Skills were built through endless repetition. The same hands that learned to carry water in childhood would later harvest grain, build walls, or steer boats. As dawn spread across the valley, farmers entered the fields. The earth near the river was dark and rich. It smelled of water and growing plants. Irrigation channels carried precious moisture toward rows of crops. Men walked along the narrow banks, inspecting the condition of the fields before the heat of the day arrived. The work demanded constant attention. A broken canal wall could damage an entire harvest. Animals had to be watched. Weeds had to be removed. Seeds needed careful planting. There was always another task waiting. One farmer paused and looked toward the river. He had performed this same work for decades. The view before him had changed very little. Palm trees swayed in the distance. Birds crossed the morning sky. Smoke rose from village ovens. His life was difficult, but it was familiar. The familiar nature of Egyptian life brought its own quiet comfort. People knew where they belonged. They knew the responsibilities expected of them. The routines of work connected individuals to their families and to the generations that came before. In the fields, conversations were often simple. Workers discussed the level of the flood waters. They spoke about repairs to a roof or the health of an aging relative. Sometimes they worked in silence, listening only to the sounds around them. The scraping of tools. The distant call of birds. The movement of wind through tall grasses. The quiet splash of water flowing into irrigation channels. Hours passed slowly. The sun climbed higher, and the cool air of morning gradually disappeared. Shadows shortened across the fields. Heat settled over the valley. By midday, the world seemed to move more slowly. Farmers sought shade wherever they could find it. Some rested beneath trees along the edge of the fields. Others sat beside canals with their feet near the water. They drank from clay jars and ate simple meals prepared before sunrise. Bread remained the center of nearly every meal. Sometimes there were onions, dates, or fish. Wealthier families might enjoy a greater variety of foods, but most people ate what was available and what could be grown nearby. The meals themselves reflected the repetitive rhythm of life. The same bread. The same grain. The same vegetables. Day after day. Year after year. People rarely expected novelty. Familiar foods offered security in an uncertain world. Children often carried meals to parents working far from home. A young girl balancing a basket on her head might walk along dusty roads beneath the bright sun. She knew every turn in the path. She recognized every tree and every small building along the way. The journey itself had become part of her daily life. By the time she reached adulthood, she would no longer notice the distance. In workshops closer to the center of the village, craftsmen continued their labor despite the heat. The potter sat at his wheel, surrounded by rows of unfinished vessels. Clay covered his hands and arms. Nearby, an apprentice carefully shaped a bowl that would eventually hold grain or water inside someone's home. The workshop smelled of earth and smoke. Sunlight entered through a narrow opening in the wall, illuminating dust floating in the air. Outside, donkeys passed by carrying supplies. Inside, time seemed to stand still. The potter had created thousands of jars during his life. Many had broken. Many had been carried to distant towns. Most had disappeared without leaving any trace. Still, he continued. His work mattered because ordinary life depended upon ordinary objects. Without clay jars, families could not store grain or water. Without baskets, food could not be carried from market to home. Without linen cloth, people could not protect themselves from the sun. The repetitive labor of countless workers supported the entire civilization. Nearby, scribes bent over sheets of papyrus. Their work was less physical, but no less repetitive. Young students copied the same symbols again and again until they could write them perfectly. Teachers corrected mistakes with patience and firmness. Hours passed in quiet concentration. Brushes moved across papyrus. Ink dried. New pages were unrolled. The life of a scribe offered certain comforts. Scribes often escaped the hardest physical labor, but they paid for this privilege with years of study and discipline. Their days were filled with lists, measurements, and records. They counted sacks of grain. They measured fields. They recorded taxes. The work rarely changed. For some, that predictability brought satisfaction. Elsewhere, servants moved through the homes of wealthier families. They swept floors, washed clothing, carried water, and prepared food. Their tasks were constant and often invisible. A servant might spend hours cleaning a courtyard only to repeat the same work the next day. The repetitive nature of service shaped entire lives. Young servants learned quickly that there was always another task waiting. One basket emptied meant another basket to fill. One room cleaned meant another room to sweep. As afternoon approached, the heat became heavy. The streets grew quieter. Animals rested in patches of shade. Merchants sat beside their goods, waiting for customers. The bright energy of morning gave way to a slower pace. Even the air seemed tired. Dust hung above the roads. Stone walls radiated warmth gathered throughout the day. The distant desert shimmered beneath the sun. For laborers working on large building projects, these hours were especially difficult. Stonecutters swung heavy tools with aching arms. Teams of workers pulled enormous blocks across prepared roads. Supervisors watched carefully while scribes kept records of supplies and attendance. The work demanded cooperation. No one moved great stones alone. Ropes tightened. Feet pressed into the earth. Voices rose together in measured rhythms designed to keep everyone moving at the same pace. The labor was exhausting, but it was also deeply repetitive. One stone followed another. One journey across the worksite followed the next. Days became months. Months became years. Many workers spent large portions of their lives surrounded by dust and stone, repeating the same movements until their bodies knew them without thought. By late afternoon, relief slowly arrived. The sun lowered toward the western horizon. Shadows lengthened across the fields and villages. Workers began to gather their tools and make their way home. The roads filled once more. Farmers walked beside donkeys carrying supplies. Fishermen returned with their catch. Children ran ahead, eager for the evening meal. Smoke rose from ovens. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the streets. Inside homes, families prepared for another night. Water was carried inside. Animals were fed. Floors were swept. Children washed dust from their feet. As darkness settled over the Nile Valley, the noise of the day gradually disappeared. Lamps flickered against mud-brick walls. Quiet conversations drifted upward toward the stars. The river continued its endless journey through the darkness, flowing past villages where generation after generation had lived remarkably similar lives. Above them, the night sky remained unchanged. The same stars had watched over their ancestors. The same moon reflected upon the water. And beneath that ancient sky, ordinary people closed their eyes, rested their tired bodies, and prepared themselves to begin the familiar rhythm once more when morning returned. The hours just before sunrise were often the quietest moments in ancient Egypt. The darkness remained over the Nile, but it had begun to lose its strength. A faint silver light rested on the river, and the stars nearest the horizon slowly disappeared behind the coming day. For a little while, the world seemed to pause between sleep and labor. Across the valley, people still lay on woven mats or simple beds made from wood and rope. Children turned in their sleep while older relatives listened to the sounds of the village waking around them. The night breeze drifted through narrow windows, carrying with it the smell of damp earth, smoke, and water. An elderly woman, awake before the others in her home, sat quietly beside the doorway. She had seen many seasons pass. She remembered floods that had reached unusually high along the riverbanks and years when the water had come later than expected. She remembered the births of grandchildren and the funerals of friends. Yet when she thought back over her life, individual memories often blended together into a long pattern of ordinary days. Most people in Egypt experienced life that way. The great events recorded by scribes and carved into temple walls belonged to rulers, priests, and officials. The lives of ordinary families were measured by much smaller things. A cracked water jar. A successful harvest. A repaired roof before the flood season. The arrival of a healthy child. And beneath all of these moments ran the same steady current of repetition. The woman rose and stepped outside. The ground beneath her feet was cool. Across the village, other doors opened. Figures moved through the darkness carrying baskets and tools. Somewhere nearby, a donkey let out a low cry before falling silent once more. The day had begun. The rhythm of Egypt depended on thousands of small actions taking place at nearly the same time. Along the riverbank, fishermen untied their boats from wooden posts. In distant fields, farmers prepared their animals. Inside crowded homes, fires were being lit for the morning meal. Even before the sun appeared, labor had already started. In one house, two sisters sat beside a grinding stone. Their mother measured grain from a clay jar and poured it carefully onto the flat surface. The younger sister was still learning. Her arms tired quickly, and her movements lacked the smooth rhythm of her older sibling. But she would learn. Every person in Egypt learned through repetition. There were few written instructions for ordinary work. Most knowledge passed from one generation to the next through observation and practice. A child watched. Then copied. Then repeated. Years later, the movements became natural. The younger sister pressed the stone forward, then pulled it back again. Fine dust from the grain settled onto her hands and clothing. The sound filled the room, joining the countless similar sounds coming from homes across the valley. Outside, the eastern sky had begun to glow. The Nile reflected pale colors as fishermen pushed their boats into the water. Their vessels were simple, built from wood and repaired many times over the years. Every scratch and every patch told a story of storms, rough currents, and long days spent under the sun. The fishermen spoke quietly as they worked. They had known one another for years. They knew who preferred to cast nets near the reeds and who favored the deeper water farther from shore. They knew which men complained about aching backs and which boys were eager to prove themselves. As the boats drifted away from the bank, the village slowly disappeared behind them. The fishermen dipped their oars into the calm water and watched the shoreline grow smaller. Morning birds crossed overhead. Fish occasionally disturbed the surface, leaving circles that spread outward and vanished. The work demanded patience. There were no quick rewards. Nets had to be prepared carefully. Hours passed between catches. Some days were generous, while others left the men disappointed. Still, they returned every morning. The repetitive lifestyle of Egypt was not built on excitement or discovery. It rested on persistence. People continued their work because their families depended upon it, because their parents had done the same, and because the river itself encouraged a steady way of life. Farther inland, the first sunlight touched the fields. Farmers moved slowly between rows of crops, inspecting irrigation channels and checking the condition of young plants. The fertile land beside the Nile was narrow compared to the vast desert beyond it, yet within that strip of green existed the heart of Egyptian life. The desert always remained nearby. From the fields, workers could look westward and see the empty landscape stretching toward the horizon. The contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side stood water, crops, and villages. On the other side lay rock, sand, and silence. Many people rarely traveled beyond the fertile valley. There was little reason to leave. A person could be born, marry, raise children, and die within a few miles of the same riverbank. Familiarity shaped their understanding of the world. The same trees, the same roads, the same neighbors, the same fields. For some, this brought comfort. For others, perhaps, it brought curiosity about distant places they would never see. But daily responsibilities left little time for wandering thoughts. As the morning progressed, the villages became busier. Merchants opened their stalls in the marketplace. Potters arranged newly fired jars outside their workshops. Weavers sat before large wooden frames and began their work. The sounds of labor mixed together. Children calling to one another. Animals moving through narrow streets. The scrape of tools against stone. Voices bargaining over grain and cloth. None of these sounds were unusual. They belonged to the ordinary music of Egyptian life. Inside a workshop near the center of the village, a carpenter bent over a piece of wood. He ran his hand across its surface, searching for rough places that needed smoothing. Nearby, his apprentice watched carefully. The carpenter had repeated these motions for decades. He knew exactly how much pressure to apply. He understood how the wood would respond to different tools. Years of experience had shaped his hands and his posture. The apprentice, however, still made mistakes. He cut too deeply. He held the tool at the wrong angle. He grew impatient. The older man corrected him without anger. Learning required time. Every skilled worker had once been inexperienced. Improvement came not through talent alone but through endless repetition. Outside, the sun climbed higher into the sky. Heat began to settle over the village. Dust rose beneath the feet of passing animals and drifted through beams of sunlight. Women carrying water jars moved carefully through crowded streets, balancing their loads with practiced ease. Water shaped every aspect of life. Fetching it was a daily responsibility, one repeated so often that many people hardly noticed the effort involved. Clay jars had to be carried from the river to homes, workshops, and building sites. The journey was familiar. Down the same paths. Past the same houses. Along the same riverbank, children often accompanied their parents, learning how to balance the weight and avoid spilling precious water. For the wealthy, servants performed much of this labor. But for ordinary families, the work belonged to everyone. As midday approached, the heat became difficult to ignore. The air grew heavy. Stone walls warmed beneath the sun. Workers wiped sweat from their faces and searched for shade. Meals during these hours were simple. Bread, onions, dried fish, and dates appeared on low tables. Workers sat together in silence or exchanged quiet conversations about crops, family members, and the condition of the river. Food was rarely varied. Most people ate similar meals throughout their lives. The repetition extended even to taste. Children grew up expecting familiar flavors and familiar smells. The scent of baking bread. The sharpness of onions. The smoke from cooking fires. The freshness of river fish. These things formed the background of daily existence. After eating, some workers rested briefly. Farmers sat beneath palm trees, leaning against rough trunks. Builders stretched aching muscles beside unfinished walls. Merchants lowered cloth coverings to create patches of shade over their goods. Fatigue followed everyone. The physical demands of Egyptian life left little room for comfort. Bodies wore down slowly over the years. Hands became calloused. Knees stiffened. Backs ached from carrying heavy loads. Many people lived with constant pain. An old fisherman might wake each morning with sore shoulders from decades of rowing. A woman who had spent years grinding grain could feel the strain in her arms and neck. Labor shaped the body as surely as the river shaped the land. Yet work continued. Near one of the great construction sites, teams of laborers pulled stone blocks across packed earth. Sweat covered their skin. Dust clung to their clothing. Supervisors called instructions while scribes recorded supplies and attendance. The labor was repetitive in the extreme. A rope tightened. A stone moved. The workers rested. Then the process began again. For months, sometimes years, men performed the same tasks. They lifted, carried, pushed, and pulled beneath the endless sky. At night, they returned to crowded sleeping quarters. The camps surrounding large building projects possessed their own routines. Fires burned as meals were prepared. Water jars passed from hand to hand. Men spoke quietly about families waiting in distant villages. Many missed home. They thought about children growing older without them. They imagined wives baking bread before dawn or fathers working familiar fields along the river. Even far from home, repetition remained. The meals were similar. The work was similar. The nights beneath the stars felt familiar. As the afternoon light softened, life throughout Egypt began to slow once again. Fishermen guided boats back toward shore. Merchants packed away unsold goods. Farmers gathered tools and checked animals before leaving the fields. Children waited eagerly for returning parents. Dogs barked in the streets. Smoke rose into the evening air. The village transformed itself from a place of labor into a place of rest. Inside one home, a family gathered around a simple meal. The father spoke about repairs needed in the irrigation canal. His eldest son listened carefully, knowing that he would soon inherit many of these responsibilities. The younger children ate quietly. An old grandmother sat nearby, weaving reeds into a basket with hands that still remembered movements learned many decades earlier. The room glowed with the light of an oil lamp. Shadows danced across the walls. Outside, the sky darkened from gold to deep blue. Night arrived gradually along the Nile. Birds disappeared into the reeds. The sounds of work faded away. Families climbed to rooftops carrying blankets and woven mats. Above them, the stars returned. For generations beyond counting, people had looked upward at those same stars after long days of labor. Farmers, scribes, fishermen, servants, builders, and merchants all rested beneath the same sky. The monuments of Egypt would one day stand as symbols of greatness, but the civilization itself depended on quieter things. It depended on tired hands grinding grain before sunrise. It depended on fishermen rowing into the mist. It depended on children carrying water along dusty roads. It depended on workers returning home each evening with aching muscles and familiar thoughts. And as the Nile continued its endless journey through the darkness, another ordinary day slowly drifted closer, waiting patiently beyond the horizon. The night along the Nile remained calm and endless. Above the villages, the stars moved slowly across the sky, just as they had for generations before. The river continued flowing beside sleeping homes, carrying the memories of countless people whose lives followed the same quiet patterns. Inside those homes, families rested after another day of work. The sounds of the evening had disappeared. Cooking fires had become small glowing pieces of ash. Clay lamps burned low. The warm air of the day had finally escaped from the mud-brick walls, leaving behind a cooler silence. For a few hours, ancient Egypt belonged to stillness. But even in sleep, the routines of life remained close. A farmer dreamed of fields waiting beneath the morning sun. A fisherman dreamed of calm waters and heavy nets. A builder dreamed of stone and unfinished walls. A mother dreamed of her children growing older and carrying on the same traditions she had inherited. When morning arrived, the cycle would begin again. This endless return was the foundation of ordinary Egyptian life. The people of the Nile Valley lived in a world where repetition was not unusual. It was expected. The same river flooded the same fields. The same crops grew from the same soil. The same families passed down the same skills. The same paths carried the same footsteps. Life moved like the river itself. Slowly. Steadily. Without hurry. Long before the sun touched the horizon, workers at large building sites began to wake. The sleeping quarters were simple and crowded. Mats covered the floors. Tools rested against walls. Clothing hung from wooden pegs. The air inside carried the smell of yesterday's meals and the dust that had followed workers home. A man opened his eyes and remained still for a moment. His body felt heavy. His shoulders carried the memory of lifting stone. His hands were rough from years of holding tools. Every morning began with the same small struggle between the desire to remain resting and the responsibility waiting outside. He sat up. Around him, others did the same. No one needed to explain what came next. They knew the routine. Wash. Dress. Eat. Gather tools. Walk toward the work site. The workers moved through the early darkness carrying baskets, ropes, and simple equipment. Their footsteps created a quiet rhythm across the ground. The construction area slowly came alive. Fires were lit. Food was prepared. Tools were inspected. Scribes arrived with their materials, ready to record the activities of the day. The work of building Egypt's great structures depended on thousands of repeated actions. A single block required many hands. A single wall required countless stones. A single monument required years of ordinary labor. To the workers, the process was not a distant symbol of greatness. It was their daily life. It was sore muscles at the end of the day. It was dust on their skin. It was the taste of bread eaten beside a fire after hours beneath the sun. It was another morning beginning exactly like the one before. The quarries were among the most demanding places. Workers traveled to areas where stone could be removed from the earth. The landscape was dry and harsh. The ground reflected the heat. The air carried fine particles of dust that settled everywhere. The men worked carefully. They marked sections of stone. They struck surfaces with tools. They separated pieces that would later be shaped and transported. The process was slow. Stone did not yield quickly. Each strike required patience. Each movement needed control. A careless action could damage the material or injure a worker. The rhythm continued throughout the day. Strike. Pause. Move. Repeat. Many workers became deeply connected to these movements. Their bodies learned the work until thought was no longer necessary. The hands moved almost automatically. The same was true throughout Egyptian society. A person who worked with their hands for many years developed a relationship with their craft. The repetition became a kind of memory stored inside the body. A fisherman knew the weight of a net before lifting it. A farmer knew the condition of soil by touching it. A carpenter knew the quality of wood by feeling its surface. Experience came from time. And time came from repetition. Away from the construction sites, village life continued at the same quiet pace. Women gathered together to prepare food and complete household tasks. Their work often began before sunrise and continued until after sunset. Preparing meals, caring for children, making clothing, and maintaining the home required constant attention. A household never truly stopped needing care. Water had to be carried. Grain had to be prepared. Clothing had to be repaired. Storage jars had to be cleaned. The same responsibilities returned each day. In many homes, older family members taught younger ones the small details that made life possible. A grandmother showed a child how to recognize good grain. A father explained how to repair a fishing net. A mother demonstrated how to shape bread correctly. Knowledge moved quietly through generations. There were no grand ceremonies for these lessons. They happened during ordinary moments, beside cooking fires, along riverbanks, and inside workshops filled with dust. The passing of knowledge was one of the strongest traditions in Egypt. People trusted methods that had survived for hundreds of years. They believed that the wisdom of ancestors carried value. Change was not always viewed as improvement. Stability itself was considered important. The river provided an example. Every year, it followed its familiar cycle. The waters rose. The fields flooded. The waters withdrew. The soil became ready for planting. This pattern shaped the Egyptian understanding of life. Everything had its proper time. Everything returned. Even the seasons of human life followed a similar rhythm. Children became helpers. Helpers became workers. Workers became elders. Elders became teachers. Then new generations continued the same cycle. In the villages, this connection between generations was visible everywhere. A young boy walking beside his father through the fields was not simply helping with work. He was learning how his family survived. A girl grinding grain beside her mother was not simply preparing food. She was learning a skill that would support her future household. A young apprentice watching a craftsman was not simply observing. He was slowly becoming part of a tradition. Life was built through these small transfers of knowledge. The marketplaces also reflected the repetitive nature of Egyptian society. Merchants arrived at similar times each morning. They placed their goods in familiar locations. Customers followed familiar routes through the stalls. The same conversations happened again and again. A farmer traded grain. A fisherman sold fish. A potter exchanged jars. A family purchased supplies. The market changed constantly in small ways, but its deeper rhythm remained unchanged. A merchant who spent decades selling goods might recognize generations of customers. He would see children grow into adults. He would watch families expand and change while his own routine continued. The market was a place where time became visible. Years passed, but the same activities remained. In the evenings, after the market closed, merchants counted their remaining goods and returned home through quiet streets. Their feet carried them along paths they knew almost without looking. The same stones beneath their sandals. The same walls beside the road. The same sounds of families preparing dinner. Ancient Egyptian towns were filled with these familiar patterns. People knew one another. They knew who lived in each home. They knew which family had recently welcomed a child and which neighbor needed assistance repairing a wall. Community was created through repeated contact. Because people often remained in the same area for their entire lives, relationships developed slowly and deeply. A neighbor was not simply someone nearby. A neighbor was someone whose family had shared the same streets for years. Someone who had borrowed tools. Someone who had helped during illness. Someone who had attended weddings and funerals. Someone who understood the rhythms of another household. The repetitive nature of life created strong connections between people. As evening approached, families returned to their homes once again. The process repeated itself. Tools were placed aside. Animals were fed. Food was prepared. Children settled down. The sounds of the village softened. A father washed dust from his hands. A mother removed bread from the oven. An older child carried water inside before darkness fully arrived. The home became a place of recovery. After the demands of the outside world, people returned to familiar walls and familiar faces. The simplicity of these evenings created their own kind of peace. There were no sudden interruptions. No constant movement. No endless stream of unfamiliar things. The day had a beginning. A middle. An ending. Then another beginning. Under the stars, people found comfort in the knowledge that tomorrow would arrive in much the same way. The Nile would still flow. The sun would still rise. The fields would still need attention. The bread would still need preparation. The work would continue. And perhaps this was the quiet secret behind Egypt's long-lasting civilization. It was not only the monuments or the rulers that carried the culture forward. It was the ordinary repetition of millions of lives. Every morning when a farmer entered the field, he continued an ancient practice. Every time a woman prepared bread, she continued a tradition older than memory. Every time a worker shaped stone, he joined the hands of countless people before him. The past remained alive through repetition. The valley remembered through its people. And as another night settled gently over ancient Egypt, the villages along the Nile returned once again to silence. The river moved beneath the moon. The desert winds whispered beyond the fields. The lamps inside homes slowly disappeared. And beneath the endless sky, ordinary people rested, waiting for another familiar morning to begin. The quiet hours before sunrise returned once again to the Nile Valley. The darkness was gentle, not empty. It carried the sounds of a world that never truly stopped moving. The river flowed beside the sleeping villages. Small waves touched the shore. Reeds moved with the wind. Somewhere far away, an animal stirred inside a simple enclosure. Ancient Egypt rested, but it was never completely still. Even during the deepest hours of night, the land held traces of the lives that had filled the day. The smell of smoke remained near cooking areas. Footprints from workers still marked dusty paths. Tools leaned against walls, waiting for tired hands to pick them up again. Tomorrow was already prepared. The people who lived beside the Nile understood that their lives were connected to countless cycles. The movement of the sun, the changing seasons, the rising and falling of the river, the growth of crops, the aging of families. Everything returned. Everything followed a pattern. As the first birds began to call from the riverbank, another morning slowly unfolded. Inside a small home near the fields, a father woke before his children. He sat quietly for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds around him. The house was still dark. His family slept nearby. The cool air of night had not yet disappeared. He looked around the room. The same clay jars. The same woven baskets. The same wooden tools. The same walls that had protected his family through many seasons. There was comfort in these familiar things. For many Egyptians, home was not defined by size or decoration. A home was the place where daily routines happened. It was where bread was prepared, where children learned, where stories were shared, and where tired bodies finally rested. The father stepped outside. The ground was cool beneath his feet. Above him, the stars slowly faded. The eastern sky began to brighten. Another day had arrived. Near the river, fishermen were already preparing their boats. They moved quietly, following habits that had become almost automatic. Ropes were checked. Nets were examined. Supplies were placed carefully inside the boats. A fisherman could perform many of these tasks without looking. His hands remembered. Years of repetition had created a kind of silent knowledge. He knew when a rope needed replacing. He knew how tightly a knot should be tied. He knew the weight of a net before throwing it. This knowledge was not found in books. It lived inside experience. The same was true for farmers. A farmer could look across a field and notice small changes that others might miss. The color of plants. The moisture of soil. The condition of irrigation channels. His understanding came from thousands of mornings spent walking through the same land. He had learned from his father. His father had learned from someone before him. The lessons traveled quietly through time. As the sun rose higher, the fields became filled with movement. Workers carried tools along narrow paths. Animals pulled wooden plows through the earth. Children followed behind adults, learning the responsibilities they would one day inherit. The rhythm of farming was slow. There was no need to rush. Plants could not be forced to grow faster. The river could not be ordered to rise earlier. The land demanded patience. Farmers understood waiting better than most people. They waited for the flood waters. They waited for seeds to grow. They waited for harvest. Much of their lives existed between moments of action. The land taught them patience. Beyond the fields, villages continued their own routines. Inside homes, women prepared meals and cared for children. In workshops, craftsmen began their daily tasks. In administrative buildings, scribes organized records. Every person had a place within the larger rhythm. The repetitive lifestyle of Egypt created a society where each role connected with others. The farmer produced grain. The baker transformed grain into bread. The merchant carried goods between communities. The craftsman created tools and containers. The scribe recorded information. The laborer built structures. No single person could maintain the entire system alone. The civilization depended on ordinary cooperation. In a busy workshop, a group of craftsmen worked beneath a shaded roof. The walls blocked some of the heat, but the air remained warm. Tools rested nearby. Pieces of unfinished work covered wooden surfaces. One man carved stone carefully. The motion was slow. He removed small pieces at a time, knowing that rushing could ruin the shape. His hands had performed the same movement for many years. A younger worker watched closely. The older craftsman did not need to speak much. The younger man learned by observing. He noticed how the tool was held, how much pressure was applied, and how the material responded. This was how many professions survived. Through watching. Through repeating. Through patience. The ancient Egyptians lived in a world where mastery came from time rather than speed. A person became skilled by performing a task again and again until the body understood what the mind no longer needed to explain. The same principle applied to music, writing, farming, fishing, and construction. Repetition created familiarity. Familiarity created confidence. Confidence created tradition. Near the temples, another form of routine continued. Priests followed carefully established schedules. The ceremonies performed within temple walls were repeated according to traditions preserved for generations. The buildings themselves carried the weight of the past. Stone columns stood beneath the sky. Carved walls showed scenes from earlier times. Incense filled the air during rituals. To those outside the temples, these places seemed distant and mysterious. But inside, the daily lives of priests were also filled with ordinary repetition. They cleaned sacred spaces. They prepared offerings. They followed established practices. The importance of their work came from consistency. A ceremony performed once was only a moment. A ceremony repeated for hundreds of years became tradition. This idea existed throughout Egyptian society. A single loaf of bread was ordinary. Millions of loaves prepared over generations became a symbol of survival. A single journey across a field was simple. Thousands of farmers walking the same paths created the foundation of agriculture. A single stone moved by workers seemed small. Thousands of stones shaped the landscape of Egypt. The civilization was created through countless repeated actions. As the day continued, the heat once again settled over the valley. The bright sun covered everything. The river reflected the light like polished stone. Dust floated above roads. The air became heavy. People adjusted their movements. They worked during cooler hours when possible. They rested during the strongest heat. They understood the environment because their lives depended upon it. A worker at a construction site wiped sweat from his face and looked toward the shade of a nearby wall. His body felt tired, but this feeling was familiar. He had experienced it many times before. The exhaustion was not a surprise. It was part of the day. In ancient Egypt, people often lived close to the limits of physical endurance. Their bodies were constantly used. Their hands were constantly busy. Yet they also developed a strong sense of resilience. They knew how to continue. They knew how to adapt. They knew how to find small moments of comfort within difficult conditions. A cool drink from a clay jar. A few minutes beneath a tree. The sound of family voices at sunset. Fresh bread after a long day. These simple things carried great importance. For a person who had spent hours beneath the sun, the evening breeze could feel like a gift. For someone who had worked with stone all day, removing sandals and resting tired feet could feel like peace. For a mother who had spent the day caring for children and preparing food, the quiet of night could bring a welcome moment of stillness. The beauty of ordinary life existed in these small experiences. As evening approached, the village began preparing for rest. Fishermen returned with their boats. Farmers gathered tools. Workers left construction sites. The streets slowly changed from places of labor into places of family life. Children played near doorways while adults completed final tasks. Someone repaired a basket. Someone cleaned a tool. Someone prepared tomorrow's supplies. Even the preparation for rest followed a familiar pattern. Nothing was wasted. Everything had a purpose. When darkness finally arrived, lamps appeared inside homes. Their small flames created circles of light against mud brick walls. Outside those circles, the village disappeared into shadow. Families gathered together. They ate. They spoke. They rested. The conversations were not about distant lands or unknown futures. They were usually about the immediate world around them. The condition of the crops. The health of relatives. The work waiting tomorrow. The small concerns of everyday existence. These conversations connected generations. A child listening to an elder speak about farming learned more than information. The child learned how to understand the world. The elderly carried memories. The young carried the future. Between them existed the continuous thread of tradition. Later, when the lamps grew weaker, families prepared for sleep. Some remained inside their homes. Others climbed to rooftops where the night air was cooler. Above them, the stars stretched across the sky. The same stars that had watched over farmers and fishermen centuries earlier. The same stars that would continue shining long after these people were gone. The Nile moved quietly below. The desert remained silent beyond the fields. The village rested. And somewhere inside those sleeping homes, another generation dreamed of the same river, the same land, and the same simple rhythm that had shaped Egyptian life for countless years. The morning would return. The work would begin again. The bread would rise. The boats would leave the shore. The fields would call. The stones would be lifted. And the ancient rhythm would continue, gentle and steady, carried forward by ordinary hands beneath the endless Egyptian sky. The darkness slowly covered the Nile Valley once again. The last traces of sunlight disappeared behind the western desert, leaving behind a quiet landscape of deep blue shadows and silver reflections. The villages became calmer with every passing moment. Doors closed. Fires softened into glowing embers. The voices of families became quieter until only the sounds of the river and the night wind remained. For the people of ancient Egypt, night was not only a time of rest. It was a bridge between one familiar day and another. The body recovered. The mind became quiet. The hands that had worked since sunrise finally became still. Yet even during these peaceful hours, the connection between yesterday and tomorrow remained strong. A fisherman knew that his boat would wait beside the river in the morning. A farmer knew that his field would need attention. A baker knew that grain would need to be prepared again. Life was always moving toward the next repetition. The next sunrise. The next task. The next season. In a small village near the river, a family slept beneath the open sky. The roof of their home was flat and covered with woven mats. During the hottest months, sleeping outside offered relief from the warmth trapped inside the mud brick rooms. The father rested on one side of the roof. The mother slept near the children. Above them, the stars remained bright and endless. There was something peaceful about the predictability of their world. The same roof had sheltered their family for years. The same stars had watched over their grandparents. The same river had provided water, food, and transportation since before anyone could remember. The world was not changing quickly. And perhaps that was exactly why it felt understandable. Modern ideas of constant change did not exist in this ancient landscape. People did not wake each morning expecting something completely different. Their hopes were often simpler. A good harvest. Healthy children. A strong home. Enough food. A peaceful year. These were the wishes that filled ordinary conversations along the Nile. As dawn approached again, another cycle began. The first workers leaving their homes created quiet movements through the streets. A man carried a bundle of tools wrapped in cloth. Another carried a basket filled with food prepared before sunrise. Their footsteps joined the countless footsteps that had crossed these same paths before. Ancient roads remembered the weight of generations. Farmers walked toward fields where their ancestors had worked. Fishermen pushed boats into waters where their families had fished for many years. Merchants opened stalls in markets that followed old traditions. The landscape itself seemed to understand repetition. The Nile rose and fell. The sun traveled across the sky. The seasons returned. And people adjusted their lives around these natural rhythms. Among the farmers, the preparation of the land required constant attention. A field was never simply finished. After planting came watering. After watering came waiting. After waiting came protection from birds and animals. After growth came harvesting. After harvesting came preparation for the next cycle. The land demanded patience. A farmer could not force the river to provide more water. He could not command the crops to grow faster. He had to accept the pace of nature. This acceptance shaped Egyptian life deeply. People learned to wait. They learned to observe. They learned that many important things could not be hurried. A young farmer walking beside his father through the fields slowly gained this understanding. At first, he wanted to work quickly. He wanted to finish tasks sooner. But the older man showed him something different. He showed him how to notice small details. The color of the plants. The softness of the soil. The movement of water through the canals. The condition of the animals. The land spoke quietly, and learning to listen required years. The same patience appeared in other professions. A fisherman did not control the river. A craftsman did not rush the material. A scribe did not skip the process of learning. Everyone depended on time. Inside homes, another kind of work continued. Clothing required maintenance. Linen garments were washed, repaired, and reused. Fabric represented valuable effort because producing it required growing plants, preparing fibers, spinning threads, and weaving them into cloth. A simple piece of clothing contained many hours of human labor. Because resources were precious, people cared for what they owned. A torn garment was repaired. A broken basket was woven again. A damaged tool was fixed if possible. Objects remained in use for years because replacing them was not simple. This careful relationship with possessions shaped everyday life. People understood the value of things because they knew the work behind them. A clay jar was not just a container. It represented the person who shaped the clay. The fire that hardened it. The hands that carried it. The family that depended upon it. A basket was not just a basket. It represented reeds gathered from the river. Time spent weaving. A skill passed down through generations. Nothing existed separately from human effort. In the workshops, artisans continued creating the objects that supported daily life. A stone worker shaped tools. A carpenter repaired wooden equipment. A potter created vessels. A weaver produced cloth. Their work was repetitive, but it was essential. The ordinary objects they created allowed Egypt to function. Without them, homes could not store supplies, workers could not perform their tasks, and families could not maintain their routines. The greatness of Egypt was built not only from enormous monuments, but from millions of smaller creations. A bowl, a basket, a sandal, a fishing net, a wooden handle, a simple tool. These everyday objects carried the weight of civilization. In the quieter corners of Egyptian towns, merchants continued their familiar routines. A merchant who sold grain might spend decades standing beneath the same marketplace covering. He knew the regular customers. He knew which families purchased large amounts and which families bought only what they needed. He understood the changing seasons because they affected his trade. During harvest time, grain filled the markets. During dry periods, people became more careful. Trade followed the rhythm of agriculture. Even commerce was connected to repetition. The movement of goods between villages and towns created another cycle. Farmers produced. Merchants transported. Families purchased. Workers consumed. Then the process began again. Along the river, boats carried supplies between communities. The Nile served as a natural road. Traveling by water was often easier than crossing the dry land. Boats moved slowly with the current, carrying grain, stone, wood, and other materials. For those who lived near the river, the water was not just part of the landscape. It was part of daily existence. Children learned to swim near the shore. Fishermen learned its patterns. Farmers depended upon its flooding. Merchants depended upon its movement. The river connected everyone. As the years passed, people became deeply attached to the places they knew. A village was more than a collection of homes. It was a collection of memories. A certain tree where children played. A certain path where workers walked. A certain area beside the river where families gathered in the evening. A certain house where grandparents had lived. The physical world carried emotional meaning. Even simple locations became important because they were repeated throughout a person's life. An old fisherman returning to shore after many years would recognize the same bends in the river. A farmer looking across his fields would remember the people who had stood there before him. The landscape became a record of human experience. As another afternoon arrived, the familiar heat spread across the valley. Workers slowed their movements. The bright sun covered everything. The desert beyond the fields remained silent and endless. Inside the shade of a small workshop, a craftsman continued working. His hands moved slowly now. Age had taken away some of his strength, but not his knowledge. A younger worker stood beside him, learning the final details of the craft. The older man demonstrated small techniques that could only be learned through experience. How to feel the weight of a tool. How to recognize good material. How to avoid mistakes. These lessons were not written on papyrus. They lived in human memory. When the younger worker eventually became old, he would pass the same knowledge to another generation. This was how traditions survived. Quietly. Patiently. Through ordinary moments. As evening arrived, the village returned to its familiar transformation. The places of labor became places of rest. Fields became silent. Workshops closed. Markets emptied. Families returned home. The smell of cooking fires spread through the streets. Bread was prepared once again. The same ingredients. The same methods. The same comforting aroma. A child waiting near the oven knew exactly what was coming. This smell had been part of life since before memory. It belonged to home. After the evening meal, families gathered beneath the fading light. Older relatives told stories. Children listened. The stories were often about ancestors, local traditions, or lessons learned from past experiences. Through these stories, the past remained close. A person living beside the Nile was never truly alone. They were surrounded by generations who had performed the same actions, walked the same roads, and watched the same river. The night became quiet. The lamps grew smaller. The stars appeared. And once again, ancient Egypt rested beneath the sky. The world of ordinary people continued not through sudden moments of transformation, but through countless peaceful repetitions. Morning after morning. Season after season. Generation after generation. The Nile flowed. The fields grew. The bread was baked. The stones were shaped. The boats traveled. The families gathered. And slowly, quietly, the repetitive lifestyle of Egypt carried an entire civilization forward. The night settles gently over the ancient Nile Valley. The sounds of the day have finally disappeared. The footsteps on dusty roads have faded. The voices from the marketplaces have grown quiet. The tools that shaped stone and wood have been placed aside. The ovens that baked bread have cooled into darkness. Only the river continues. The Nile moves slowly beneath the moonlight, carrying the same peaceful waters that passed beside countless villages long ago. Its gentle movement fills the silence, flowing past fields, homes, and sleeping communities. For thousands of years, ordinary people lived beside this river. Farmers who woke before sunrise. Fishermen who followed the quiet waters. Builders who carried stone beneath the warm desert sun. Craftsmen who repeated their skills until their hands remembered every movement. Mothers who prepared bread beside small fires. Children who learned the traditions of their families. Scribes who carefully recorded the details of daily life. Their names are mostly forgotten now. Their voices have disappeared into time. Their footsteps have been covered by the passing centuries. Yet the rhythm of their lives remains. It can still be felt in the silent fields, in the ancient walls, and in the endless movement of the river. The truth about Egypt's repetitive lifestyle was not found only in grand temples or enormous monuments. It lived in the quiet moments that happened every day. A hand grinding grain before morning. A boat leaving the shore as the sun appeared. A worker resting beneath a palm tree. A family sharing a simple meal after a long day. A child falling asleep beneath the stars. These small moments created the foundation of an entire civilization. Life in ancient Egypt was often difficult. The days were long. The work was demanding. The heat was unforgiving. Illness and exhaustion were familiar parts of existence. But within that hardship was also a sense of connection. People belonged to a rhythm older than themselves. They followed the river. They followed the seasons. They followed traditions passed down through generations. The world around them changed slowly, and their lives moved with that same gentle pace. As the final lights disappear from the village homes, families rest beneath the quiet sky. Somewhere, a fisherman sleeps beside his boat. Somewhere, a farmer dreams of green fields beside the river. Somewhere, a child listens to the soft sounds of the night and slowly drifts into sleep. The stars above them remain unchanged. The river beside them continues its journey. The desert wind moves softly across the land. And for a moment, the ancient world feels close again. A world of mud-brick homes and warm fires. A world of quiet mornings and peaceful evenings. A world where life followed the simple rhythm of work, rest, and renewal. The Nile keeps flowing through the darkness. The villages grow still. The old roads become silent. And the people of ancient Egypt, who once woke with the sunrise and rested beneath the same stars, return gently to the quiet place where all memories eventually settle. The night becomes calm. The river whispers. The desert sleeps. And the ancient world slowly fades into silence.